I remember the first time I realized the Mariana Trench wasn't just a research site. It was a cage with teeth. The water pressed against the hull so hard it felt alive, whispering warnings I couldn't understand. I had signed up to study unknown creatures, but nobody told me about the 11 rules we had to follow, just to leave the lab alive. Each one felt stranger than the last, like someone had designed them to trap our minds. I thought I could ignore them, but breaking even a small part made the darkness notice me, and I'm not sure I'll ever escape. I had always thought the hatch was just another piece of equipment, a cold slab of metal separating us from the endless pressure of the Mariana Trench. But that day, I felt its presence like a heartbeat. The lab around me seemed unnervingly quiet, every machine hum amplified, as if the walls themselves were watching. My hands itched to touch the hatch, to slide it open just enough to glance at the abyss outside, and a voice inside whispered, "It's fine, just a peek." But Rule 1, never open the external hatch without a partner present, had been drilled into me during orientation, and even my own curiosity felt like a betrayal. Mark leaned against the control panel, his smirk too casual for the tension pressing down on my chest. "Afraid of a little water?" he said, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Not because of the cold, but because the way he said it made it sound like the darkness beyond was listening. I tried to remind him about the rule, the one we all joked about but had learned through whispered warnings in the lab. He waved me off, reaching for the hatch latch with a laugh, and I could feel the metal vibrate beneath his fingers, as if it were alive. The trench waited outside, dark and silent, but I sensed that a single misstep could ripple into something we couldn't fix. The first ripple of unease hit when a faint vibration ran through the floor. The hatch wasn't moving, but the tremor seemed deliberate, like it wanted attention. I stepped closer, adjusting the pressure sensors, hoping the warning was just a malfunction. Mark shook his head. "Relax. You worry too much." I hesitated, thinking of the warning etched into my memory. Rule 1, never open the external hatch without a partner present. That was the second time I thought of it today, and the second time it made my stomach knot with fear. The abyss outside didn't just threaten death from pressure. I had the nagging feeling it judged intent, and curiosity alone could cost me. Hours passed with the hatch looming in the corner of the lab. Mark had left briefly, and I was alone, running checks on the hull integrity. Every few minutes, my eyes darted to the viewport, catching shadows that weren't supposed to exist. There was a flicker, a movement that didn't match any known sea creature, and I felt a tremor of panic. I whispered to myself, trying to anchor my thoughts. Rule 1, never open the external hatch without a partner present. Saying it aloud made it feel real again, as though the rule itself were a shield, a fragile barrier between me and whatever was pressing against the metal outside. I thought about the first time the rule had saved someone, months before I arrived. Another researcher, new like me, had insisted on checking a hatch alone. By the time someone noticed, the hatch was jammed, the pressure in the chamber rising unpredictably. No one could explain what exactly happened, only that he never came back the same. The lab had closed its logs, but the whispers among staff told the truth. The trench noticed the moment he ignored the rule, and it claimed something in return. I shivered, imagining what it meant to be noticed by that darkness. Later I was forced to face the hatch directly, when an external pressure surge triggered alarms. Lights flickered, and the lab's automated systems hummed aggressively, demanding attention. Mark returned just then, grinning. "See, nothing happens if you just touch it." I could feel the fear coiling in my chest, not just because of him, but because I knew the vibration underfoot wasn't random. It was waiting, testing boundaries. I grabbed the hatch lever alongside him, my hands cold, remembering the rule like a mantra. Rule 1, never open the external hatch without a partner present. The awareness of its necessity didn't make me feel safer. It made the stakes tangible, the abyss watching more closely than ever. We worked together to stabilize the pressure readings, and I noticed subtle ripples in the water visible through the viewport. They weren't from our movements. They had a rhythm, deliberate and slow, like someone, or something was pacing just beyond our reach. I tried to convince Mark to step back and double-check the equipment, but he was stubborn, tapping controls with casual arrogance. I couldn't shake the sensation that the trench had been waiting for someone foolish enough to break the rules, that it measured intent as sharply as pressure, and even a small violation could be fatal. Night fell in the lab faster than I expected, the deep-sea darkness compressing into the room like a physical weight. The hatch seemed to thrum softly under my fingers, a heartbeat in metal, warning or taunting, I couldn't tell. I glanced at the sensors again, nothing unusual, and yet my instincts screamed otherwise. Mark leaned in too close, brushing against my shoulder, laughing about the shadows outside. I whispered, almost to myself, that the rule existed for a reason. Rule 1, never open the external hatch without a partner present. Saying it aloud didn't calm me. It made the silence feel heavier, like the abyss outside understood the words and waited for proof of disobedience. Then the power dipped briefly, and the lights on the hatch flickered. I froze, my hands gripping the lever instinctively, and saw it, something dark, moving impossibly fast past the viewport. I gasped, shoving Mark back. He laughed, thinking I was exaggerating, but the reflection in the glass behind him told the truth. The shadow was there, following, almost breathing, and I could feel its awareness as if it could sense my fear. The rule wasn't just a guideline, it was the only thing keeping it at bay. By morning, I was shaking uncontrollably, caffeine and cold air doing nothing. We ran diagnostics, noting the hatch functioned perfectly, yet the memory of that dark movement clung to me. Mark teased me again, but I wasn't listening. I remembered every story of those who ignored Rule 1, never open the external hatch without a partner present, and I realized the trench didn't forgive mistakes. I had obeyed, barely, and survived, but the knowledge that curiosity alone could attract someone still made me shiver. As we secured the hatch for routine operations, I felt a pulse underfoot, subtle, rhythmic, and knowing. I didn't mention it to Mark, who laughed about my nerves, but I knew better. The trench was alive, aware, and it marked those who stepped too close. My hands lingered on the lever longer than necessary, praying my compliance had satisfied whatever watched, and I thought once more about Rule 1, never open the external hatch without a partner present. Breaking it wasn't an option, and yet, I sensed the trench's awareness lingering, waiting for the next mistake, the next breach. Even after we moved on with daily tasks, the memory of the hatch's presence lingered, a constant reminder that obeying the rule wasn't about policy, it was about survival. I caught myself glancing at it repeatedly, fingers twitching, mind spinning with possibilities of what lurked beyond. Every sound in the lab, the hum of machinery, the creak of metal, the subtle vibration in the floor, felt magnified, alive, and purposeful. The rule wasn't just a guideline, it was a contract, and I had no intention of breaking it. By the time the day ended, exhaustion weighed me down, but I couldn't rest. Every corner of the lab seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, shadows elongating and retreating, and my mind kept replaying the hatch's warning pulse. Mark had finally left, leaving me alone with the sensors, the darkness outside, and the terrible knowledge that even the smallest slip could bring attention from whatever watched us. The rule had saved me today, yes, but it left a lingering terror that compliance alone wasn't enough. Curiosity itself could betray you. After the night with the hatch, I became obsessed with the lab's acoustic monitors. Every groan of metal, every subtle vibration in the hull, and every whisper of water against the outer walls seemed amplified, as though the trench itself was speaking. I remembered the first time I thought about Rule 2. Always log every sound, no matter how faint or unexplainable, during our orientation, and dismissed it as paranoia. Now, alone in the lab, I realized the rule wasn't just about data, it was about survival. Even the smallest overlooked sound could carry meaning, a warning I couldn't afford to ignore. Mark, ever skeptical, leaned over my shoulder while I recorded the latest readings. "You don't need to log every creak, you know," he said, smirking. I stared at the monitors, where a faint, irregular pattern was showing, too subtle for anyone but trained ears to notice. "Every sound counts," I replied, my voice tight. The faint hum of the hull shifted suddenly, and I felt my stomach tighten, knowing it wasn't mechanical. The trench outside had noticed our activity, and the rule wasn't just paperwork, it was a shield, however fragile, against what lurked beyond. By mid-morning, the lab's silence became unbearable. Every footstep, every mechanical buzz, even the drip of condensation seemed amplified into a symphony of threats. I replayed old recordings, scanning for anomalies, when I noticed something disturbing, a low-frequency oscillation I hadn't seen before. I tried to explain it to Mark, but he waved me off. "It's probably just the machinery." I shook my head, remembering that Rule 2, always log every sound, no matter how faint or unexplainable, existed, because some sounds were alive, observant, and dangerous. I spent hours following the new anomaly, tracing it through the lab's sensor network. It wasn't consistent, and it moved in patterns that didn't align with anything we had charted. My pulse quickened as I realized the sound seemed to respond to my movements, adjusting in rhythm when I stopped and quickening when I approached. Mark finally grew curious and asked, "Why are you so obsessed with a noise?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain that ignoring it felt like inviting attention from the trench itself. The rule wasn't arbitrary, it was a lifeline. Later, during a routine check of the external sensors, the oscillation grew stronger, resonating through the floor and walls, vibrating in a way that was almost communicative. I could feel it in my chest, each pulse a reminder that our isolation made us vulnerable. I recorded it meticulously, annotating every spike, every irregularity. Mark, still skeptical, rolled his eyes but followed my instructions anyway. I whispered, almost as if the trench might hear, that the sounds were not random, and that Rule 2, always log every sound, no matter how faint or unexplainable, could save us if we paid attention. By evening, tension had mounted to a fever pitch. The lab's artificial lights flickered subtly, shadows dancing across walls, and the sound anomaly seemed to echo from multiple points at once. I could feel my own heartbeat synchronizing with it, a terrifying mimicry of the rhythm outside. Mark attempted to dismiss it again, joking about deep-sea ghosts, but his usual confidence wavered. I knew we couldn't ignore it. Every unlogged creak or pulse might carry consequences. The trench wasn't just dark, it was aware, waiting for a slip, and the rule was the only buffer between caution and calamity. The hours blurred into each other as I monitored, annotated, and replayed the sequences. There were subtle changes in pitch, in resonance, patterns that repeated but never identically. The deeper we went, the more the sounds felt intentional, as if the trench itself was testing our understanding, seeing if we respected its rules. I whispered into my recorder, noting every detail, every hesitation, every mechanical misalignment, hoping that if we survived, these logs would make sense. The rule, which once seemed tedious, now felt like a map through invisible danger. At one point, I left Mark to check an external panel, and the anomaly shifted rapidly, startling me. It wasn't machinery. Nothing on the schematics could explain it. I could hear faint echoes, almost like something brushing against the hull, each sound barely perceptible, yet unmistakably deliberate. I scrawled notes frantically, my hands trembling. Ignoring the rule for even a moment might be catastrophic. I thought of the hatch incident and realized that the trench paid attention to intent as much as action. Logging the sound wasn't just documentation, it was acknowledgement, a silent agreement with something vast and unseen. Mark returned and frowned at my frantic note-taking. "You're obsessed," he said, leaning in close. I shook my head. "You don't understand. It's not just a noise, it's intelligent. It's watching us, testing us." He laughed nervously, but didn't contradict me this time. I could feel the anomaly pulsing again, a low vibration through the floor, and I whispered aloud the rule for the second and final time. Rule 2. Always log every sound, no matter how faint or unexplainable. Saying it aloud was both a reassurance and a warning, a ritual to remind myself that compliance could be life-saving. Night came again, faster than it should have, and the darkness outside the viewport deepened to a blackness that felt almost tactile. The sound anomaly grew more complex, layering frequencies and patterns we hadn't recorded before. My entire body ached from hours of attention, but I couldn't stop. Every skipped detail might be a missed warning, and the trench's awareness seemed to sharpen with every lapse. I whispered the data into the recorder, my voice trembling, feeling like each word kept an unseen predator at bay. Hours later, Mark and I sat together, exhausted, eyes glued to the monitors. The anomaly had quieted slightly, but the vibrations underfoot persisted, subtle yet insistent. I dared not leave my post, fearing that even stepping away could provoke attention. The lab was suffocating, the walls alive with sound, and I realized that Rule 2, always log every sound, no matter how faint or unexplainable, was not a guideline for science. It was a survival instinct, the thin thread between life and disappearance. Before dawn, a sudden spike in the acoustic monitors sent us both reeling. The sound pattern shifted violently, echoing through the lab, and I could feel it, resonating inside my skull, a reminder that we were not alone. Mark's confidence had vanished entirely. He clutched the control panel like it was a lifeline. I pressed record, annotating every millisecond, praying that by documenting it fully, we might survive whatever awareness lurked in the water outside. The trench wasn't merely a physical danger. It was conscious, and it noticed every hesitation, every lapse, every unlogged whisper of sound. By sunrise, the anomaly had settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a pulse of warning. I rubbed my eyes, exhaustion making each observation sharper and more hallucinatory. The logs were complete, every sound accounted for, but the terror lingered, a constant pressure that the trench itself seemed to radiate. Mark didn't speak, he only nodded, finally understanding the weight of the rule. We had obeyed, barely, and survived, but the awareness that the trench would never forget a missed pulse kept me vigilant. The rule wasn't arbitrary, it was the key to staying alive. The following day, after hours of monitoring sounds and documenting the anomalies, a creeping sense of dread settled over me. Every corner of the lab seemed more oppressive, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls, as if the Mariana Trench itself had invaded our space. I remembered Rule 3, never leave the main lab without notifying another team member, but the urgency to check the outer sensors was overwhelming. My fingers itched to slip past the hatchway, to see if the faint glimmer of light outside meant a new anomaly, but fear anchored me. Stepping away without alerting someone felt like walking straight into the abyss, unseen eyes tracking every hesitation. Mark, still uneasy from the previous night's acoustic spike, watched me fidget with the equipment. "You're not planning to wander off alone again, are you?" he asked, a nervous edge to his voice. I shook my head but found it hard to resist the pull of the unknown. The trench had a rhythm now, a patience that made every second feel weighted with potential doom. I reminded myself silently of Rule 3. Never leave the main lab without notifying another team member, knowing that alerting someone wasn't just protocol, it was a lifeline against whatever observed us from the water beyond. As I approached the outer sensors, the lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the corridor. My boots made almost no sound, yet I could feel the pressure of unseen attention bearing down. Each step felt measured, necessary, as if the trench itself could sense my intent to leave without warning. Mark followed a few steps behind, muttering complaints, but I couldn't stop now. The air felt thicker here, colder, heavier, pressing on my chest with every cautious breath. Even the faint hum of machinery seemed amplified, warning me to heed the rule. We reached the first sensor array, and I knelt to inspect the readings. The faint oscillations we'd recorded yesterday had intensified, and there were subtle new signals that made my skin crawl. The trench seemed to shift with us, the dark water outside the viewport moving in unnatural currents. I whispered, more to steady myself than to warn Mark, that this is why Rule 3, never leave the main lab without notifying another team member, existed. The moment one of us moved alone, the pressure, the darkness, and the unknown forces outside seemed to react instantly, as though testing boundaries, observing our compliance with the rules we barely understood. Suddenly, a low vibration pulsed through the floor beneath my knees. Mark stiffened, eyes wide, as we both realized the noise wasn't coming from the machinery. Something large, slow-moving and deliberate was passing outside, brushing against the hull with a precision that made my stomach knot. My instincts screamed to retreat, but the sensors demanded attention. I called back to Mark, keeping my voice steady, despite the fear twisting in my chest. Stay with me, we can't go any further alone. The rule wasn't optional. Leaving the lab without alerting someone could attract attention we didn't survive. Hours passed as we monitored the shifting currents and abnormal readings. The trench outside felt alive, each vibration carrying intent, almost like a heartbeat of some massive hidden creature. Mark was quieter now, following my instructions without question. I couldn't shake the feeling that the water beyond the viewport was observing us, learning, testing whether we would follow the rules. I whispered to myself, recalling the orientation briefings. One careless move and the trench noticed. Obeying Rule 3, never leave the main lab without notifying another team member, was no longer theoretical. It was survival. As we moved to check the secondary control panels, a shadow flickered across the viewport, too fast and deliberate to be our own reflection. Mark froze, and I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The shadow lingered, a vague shifting form that seemed aware of our presence. I whispered, almost to steady my trembling hands, that the rule was meant to protect us. It wasn't about bureaucratic protocol, it was about ensuring we weren't alone when the trench decided to test its patience, and every unsupervised step felt like an invitation. The night deepened, and the lab's artificial lights dimmed in response to the external pressure, shadows crawling across walls like liquid ink. The trench pulsed against the hull rhythmically, and every footstep outside the lab's center felt magnified. I kept Mark close, sharing every observation, logging every fluctuation in the sensors, and noting every irregular vibration. The rule haunted my thoughts. If we had split up, we would already have been under direct scrutiny. Following Rule 3, never leave the main lab without notifying another team member, wasn't just policy, it was an instinctual pact with survival. By midnight, a low-frequency vibration surged suddenly under our boots, resonating through the metal floor as if the trench itself were testing the integrity of our fear. My hands trembled as I adjusted the sensor readings, careful not to alert whatever watched. Mark's usual humor had vanished completely. He was tense, silent, and wide-eyed, realizing how close we were to crossing a boundary we shouldn't. The water outside remained still in appearance, but pulsed with a hidden life, and I felt each pulse in my chest as though it were measuring our compliance. Hours dragged into dawn, each second a test of our discipline. Every unexpected hum, every subtle vibration, every flicker of the viewport lights became a puzzle we had to log, document, and react to together. Stepping outside the main lab unannounced would have drawn attention instantly. The trench seemed to sense intent, not just action. I couldn't risk testing it, and Mark finally seemed to understand, following my movements without complaint. The rule had saved us so far, yet the trench's quiet, patient awareness made me wonder if survival was ever guaranteed. Toward the early morning, we began the final round of sensor checks before mandatory rest. The shadows outside moved in patterns that defied explanation, flickering just beyond the range of light, brushing against the hull in a rhythm that was unnervingly deliberate. I whispered again to myself, quietly but firmly, the rule's second natural mention. Rule 3. Never leave the main lab without notifying another team member. Saying it aloud was a reassurance and a warning, a silent acknowledgement that our survival depended on observing this mandate. The trench was patient, aware, and it noticed every deviation. Even as we secured the lab for the morning, the tension lingered. Every footstep, every flicker of equipment, every breath felt observed. We had obeyed the rule, but the lingering presence of the abyss outside reminded me that compliance wasn't enough. Awareness and caution were equally vital. The trench's subtle vibrations resonated through my bones, and I knew that even a single unsanctioned step could provoke something we couldn't escape. Following Rule 3 had kept us safe so far, but I sensed that our next move would be even more dangerous. The following day, the lab was quiet, almost oppressively so, with the trench beyond the viewport stretching into unfathomable darkness. The water's blackness seemed thicker, more aware, and every shadow cast by our dim internal lights felt alive. I recalled the instructions during orientation. Rule 4. Never shine lights into unexplored areas of the trench without approval, and I realized how fragile our safety was if even a flicker of curiosity went unchecked. Mark was fiddling with a portable spotlight, teasing me about my obsession with rules, but I felt an immediate tightening in my chest. The trench didn't just observe, it judged intent, and a careless glare could bring consequences we couldn't survive. Despite Mark's mockery, I resisted the urge to sweep the beam across the unexplored darkness. The trench seemed to pulse in response to our movements, subtle currents brushing against the viewport, almost as if it recoiled when we approached too close. My fingers hovered over the light controls, and I whispered aloud, more to steady my racing heart than to warn Mark. Rule 4. Never shine lights into unexplored areas of the trench without approval. Saying it reminded me that obedience was a shield, a fragile boundary between staying safe and drawing attention from the unseen presence outside. As we began the day's routine sensor checks, I noticed faint, irregular shadows shifting deep in the trench, movements that didn't align with any known marine life. Mark, fascinated, reached for the portable light. "Come on, just a peek," he said, smirking, but I grabbed his wrist. "No," I said firmly. "The rule exists for a reason." I could feel the trench watching us, every inch of our attention measured, every twitch assessed. The shadows pulsed subtly, almost impatiently, reminding me that even the smallest infraction could have consequences we couldn't anticipate. Hours passed in tense silence, the lights dimmed to their minimum safe output, the shadows outside moving just beyond our reach. Mark eventually relented, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the uncharted darkness whenever he thought I wasn't looking. I couldn't let curiosity overrule caution. Every time I considered peering into the abyss, I reminded myself that Rule 4, never shine lights into unexplored areas of the trench without approval, wasn't a suggestion. It was survival. The darkness wasn't just empty water, it was aware, and even a brief glare could provoke something beyond comprehension. Later, while logging readings at the secondary sensor bank, I saw a strange flicker at the very edge of visibility. My pulse quickened, and I felt the old thrill of curiosity claw at my mind. Mark glanced over my shoulder, teasing, "Just a tiny light." I shook my head. The shadows seemed to shift in response to even our peripheral attention, reacting in a way that suggested cognition, not randomness. I realized that shining a light without protocol could draw the trench's awareness directly toward us, and I pressed myself back from the control panel, whispering the rule again as a mantra. By mid-afternoon, the trench's darkness seemed almost tangible. The water beyond the viewport pulsed like a living entity, shifting in slow, deliberate patterns that defied explanation. I could feel the pressure of its presence against my chest, urging me to test the boundaries, to see what lurked in the shadows. Every instinct screamed to illuminate the unexplored crevices, but the memory of Rule 4, never shine lights into unexplored areas of the trench without approval, kept my fingers frozen. Curiosity was deadly here, and the trench seemed to measure not just what we did, but what we wanted to do. Mark, growing restless, finally tried to sneak a glance into the abyss using the spotlight while I was distracted by sensor data. The moment the beam touched the water, the currents outside shifted violently, subtle at first, then with increasing intensity. I lunged for the controls, cutting the light instantly, my heart hammering. He stammered, eyes wide, finally realizing that the rule wasn't an arbitrary annoyance. The trench had reacted instantly to our breach, sending vibrations through the hull that rattled every bone in my body. Obedience had been a buffer, but even minor disobedience drew immediate consequences. Night descended faster than anticipated, and the lab's lights dimmed further to conserve energy. Shadows in the trench became deeper, almost sentient, and every reflection on the viewport seemed to flicker unnaturally. I stayed rooted at the sensor panel, glancing nervously at Mark as he silently monitored the same areas. The temptation to illuminate the unexplored darkness was unbearable, yet I reminded myself constantly that Rule 4, never shine lights into unexplored areas of the trench without approval. Survival depended on restraint. The trench was aware, and every stray beam risked attracting attention we couldn't predict. Hours later, a faint glow appeared in the distance, far beyond our recorded sensor range. It pulsed slowly, almost deliberately, and I felt a shiver run through me. The glow wasn't mechanical, it moved with intention, weaving in ways that suggested awareness. Mark whispered, "What is that?" I shook my head, keeping my hands off the light controls, knowing that even illuminating it prematurely could provoke it. The rule existed to prevent direct provocation, and I realized the trench itself was testing us, teaching the deadly lesson that curiosity could be fatal. By the time the shift ended, exhaustion weighed on both of us. Our muscles ached, our eyes burned from the constant vigilance, but we survived another day without violating the rule. The trench remained alive outside, pulsating, shifting, and leaving us with a deep, unshakable unease. I knew that every unapproved beam of light could have drawn something close, something patient and observant. Obeying Rule 4, never shine lights into unexplored areas of the trench without approval, had kept us safe, but only barely. The abyss watched, waiting, and our next move would need even more caution. After the previous night's pulse of light, I became hyper-aware of every electromagnetic reading, every signal bouncing through our instruments. The Mariana Trench was full of static and faint, incomprehensible frequencies, but orientation had drilled Rule 5. Never communicate with unknown signals or frequencies from the trench into my brain. Some were natural, some artificial, but the ones we hadn't logged were dangerous. I caught myself leaning closer to a new blip, curiosity curling like smoke in my mind, but the rule kept my hand from touching the transmitter. The trench wasn't just dark, it was intelligent, and it could respond to even subtle signals we sent. Mark hovered over the secondary console, eyes narrowed. "You're really not going to check that signal?" he asked, pointing to a flickering readout. I shook my head, gripping the panel tightly. "No, the rules exist for a reason," I muttered, trying to keep my voice calm, though every vibration underfoot felt amplified. The trench's water outside pulsed slowly, almost rhythmically, and I felt as if it could sense our intentions. The rule wasn't just about data integrity, it was about survival. Every unapproved contact could draw attention, something we couldn't anticipate. Hours passed in silence as we monitored our instruments. The faint signal persisted, a pulsing frequency that defied any known source. Mark frowned, leaning closer. "It's probably just interference. Why are you so scared of a little noise?" I felt a shiver, recalling every story of explorers who had been lost after ignoring even minor warnings. The rule existed because the trench's intelligence didn't forgive curiosity. I whispered under my breath, almost to steady myself. Rule 5. Never communicate with unknown signals or frequencies from the trench. The words hung in the air like a protective mantra. By mid-afternoon, the signals became more complex, layered with patterns that seemed deliberate. Each pulse, each fluctuation, felt as though it were observing us, testing our restraint. I traced the frequencies carefully, noting every anomaly, resisting the urge to transmit a response. Mark watched, increasingly tense, sensing that my fear was grounded in something beyond his understanding. The trench wasn't passive, it was active aware, and if we transmitted, we would invite consequences far worse than mere curiosity could imagine. Later, a sudden spike in one of the unexplained frequencies jolted the lab's sensors. Mark yelped, almost reaching for the controls, but I grabbed his wrist. "No," I hissed. "We don't touch it." My voice trembled despite the calm I tried to maintain. The spike pulsed again, slower this time, deliberate, almost intelligent. I could feel the vibration in my chest, in my bones, like the trench itself was reminding us of the rule. Ignoring Rule 5, never communicate with unknown signals or frequencies from the trench, was unthinkable. Obedience was the only buffer against what watched beyond our walls. Night descended, and the trench grew darker outside the viewport, the black water almost tangible in its stillness. The signals persisted, faintly, intermittently, yet none of them should have been ignored. I noted patterns meticulously, writing everything down, trying to understand what was alive in the abyss. Mark leaned back, silent now, finally grasping the seriousness of the rule. One wrong move, one unapproved transmission, and the trench's attention could shift in an instant, and we would be unable to hide. A subtle movement in the water caught my eye, a shadow slipping across the far edge of the viewport. My pulse quickened. The frequencies and the shadow seemed linked, synchronized in some way that made my skin crawl. I adjusted our monitoring instruments, careful not to emit even the smallest signal back. The trench wasn't just a void, it was sentient. I whispered again, for reassurance and caution, Rule 5, never communicate with unknown signals or frequencies from the trench. The rule felt like a fragile lifeline, an invisible barrier we dared not cross. Hours stretched into a tense, nerve-wracking night. Every minor fluctuation in the frequency, every faint hum of the lab, every ripple of the water outside became significant, as if the trench measured the weight of our focus. Mark sat close, eyes wide, realizing the trench's intelligence was not just metaphorical. A single sound, a single unintentional transmission, could draw attention we might never escape. Obedience wasn't enough. We had to remain vigilant, hyper-aware, respecting the invisible intelligence that pulsed beyond the viewport. By early morning, the frequencies stabilized slightly, yet the unease persisted. Every shadow seemed to move in harmony with the signals, and every vibration in the hull felt deliberate. I couldn't rest, couldn't leave the consoles, because the trench's awareness was patient and observant. Mark finally murmured, "Okay, I get it now." I didn't respond, only continued documenting the readings, knowing that even the faintest signal could provoke something we couldn't see. Following Rule 5 wasn't optional, it was survival. As dawn broke, faint light filtering through the lab's viewport, the signals grew erratic once more, testing our patience. Every beat, every spike, every modulation felt like a heartbeat of the abyss, reminding us that our actions were being measured. The trench had learned to expect obedience, but testing its boundaries could be fatal. I recorded every anomaly meticulously, whispering a final reassurance to myself: obey the rules, respect the abyss, and survive. The trench's intelligence was patient, and any misstep could be permanent. By the end of our shift, we were exhausted, physically and mentally drained. Mark no longer questioned me or the rules, and I had documented every pulse, every blip, every irregularity. The Mariana Trench outside remained a living, observing darkness, and I knew we had survived today, only by following Rule 5, never communicate with unknown signals or frequencies from the trench. The abyss was patient, but it never forgot. One careless signal, one fleeting curiosity, and the consequences would be irreversible. The day after the signal incident, I awoke to a sense of dread pressing against my chest. Even in the artificial light of the lab, the trench outside seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if it could weigh down on us at any moment. I remembered the words from orientation clearly. Rule 6. Always check your oxygen and life support systems twice before leaving the main lab. The warning had always felt precautionary, bureaucratic until now. Every glance at the displays, every tap on the sensors, reminded me that in the Mariana Trench, a minor oversight could become deadly in seconds. Mark, already prepping his suit, noticed my nervous pacing. Still obsessing over the air supply? He asked, though the humor in his voice was forced. I shook my head, unwilling to risk even a second of complacency. The hatch had taught me the cost of a single misstep. The signals had shown the trench's awareness, and now the oxygen systems demanded my full attention. The rule wasn't just about machinery, it was about survival. Skipping even a single verification felt like inviting disaster into our already tense environment. I knelt beside the main oxygen panel, checking each reading with meticulous care. Every filter, every valve, every sensor was within normal parameters, yet my fingers lingered, double-checking, triple-checking. Mark leaned in, watching quietly, the earlier bravado from our trench encounters stripped away. The hum of the life support systems echoed in the confined space of the lab, mingling with the faint pulse of pressure from the trench outside. I whispered to myself, more as reassurance than instruction. Rule 6. Always check your oxygen and life support systems twice before leaving the main lab. Knowing that one overlooked warning could mean suffocation in the abyss. Hours passed as I meticulously logged every reading and verified backup systems. The trench seemed to sense our tension, currents outside brushing against the viewport with deliberate subtlety. Mark kept close, following my actions without comment, finally understanding the severity of the rule. Any excursion outside the main lab, even a short walk to a sensor array, could be fatal if oxygen levels weren't stable. I felt the weight of the rule pressing down, a constant reminder that compliance wasn't merely recommended, it was life-saving. Later, while inspecting my suit's portable oxygen pack, a subtle vibration ran through the lab's floor. I froze, gripping the pack, as if my reaction alone could protect me. The trench was patient, but it tested boundaries, and I realized that overlooking even the smallest mechanical detail could attract its attention. Mark muttered under his breath, "It's fine, everything's fine," but I couldn't be reassured. My mind kept returning to the orientation warning, check and recheck, always. The rule was a lifeline, and hesitation, inattention, or negligence could be fatal. By mid-afternoon, we were preparing to leave the lab for a routine inspection of the outer sensors. Every step was calculated, deliberate, and slow. I double-checked the oxygen readings again, ensuring that both the main and secondary life support systems were functioning flawlessly. Mark watched silently, following the process precisely, finally trusting that my obsession with rules wasn't paranoia but necessity. The trench's darkness outside the viewport pulsed in response to our movements, an almost sentient presence reminding us that even the smallest oversight could be catastrophic. As we moved toward the hatch, I noticed faint ripples in the trench's black water, patterns that seemed deliberate, almost communicative. The thought of leaving the lab without confirming our life support systems twice made my stomach churn. I whispered the rule again under my breath, steadying my hands and focusing my mind. Rule 6. Always check your oxygen and life support systems twice before leaving the main lab. Saying it aloud grounded me, a ritual to acknowledge the peril that waited just beyond the metal walls. Hours stretched on as we completed sensor inspections, documenting currents and recording irregular pressure readings. The trench outside responded to our presence subtly, with pulses and shifts that made my skin crawl. Each observation reminded me that survival depended on strict adherence to the rules, and any deviation, however minor, could provoke attention from the abyss. I checked my suit's oxygen levels once more, feeling the reassuring hiss of the regulators and the steady glow of the life support monitor. Compliance wasn't just technical, it was instinctual, a necessity in the ever-aware environment surrounding us. Night fell, and the darkness outside deepened, pressing against the viewport in a way that felt almost alive. Mark and I returned to the lab's main area, exhausted, yet neither of us dared rest completely. Every creak, every vibration, every faint pulse from the trench felt significant, a reminder that we were being watched and measured. I lingered over the oxygen panels again, verifying redundancies, triple-checking even minor readings. The rule had become a mantra for survival, a boundary we couldn't violate without risking everything. By dawn our shift was over, yet the trench's presence lingered like a weight on my chest. Every system was functioning, but the memory of previous missteps, the hatch, the signals, the light, reminded me that survival was never guaranteed. Mark finally allowed himself a weak laugh, but I stayed focused, scanning every panel once more. The trench had taught me that obedience wasn't optional, and that Rule 6, always check your oxygen and life support systems twice before leaving the main lab, was not bureaucratic. It was essential for continuing to breathe in the darkness. Even after securing the lab, I remained on edge, aware that every ripple in the water, every subtle vibration in the floor, could indicate observation or testing. The trench waited, patient and sentient, and I realized that compliance with the rule was not enough. Vigilance, awareness, and constant attention were equally critical. Each verification of oxygen and life support systems was both literal and symbolic, a ritual ensuring that curiosity or negligence wouldn't bring death. Mark sat quietly beside me, finally understanding that the abyss was alive and responsive, and the rules were the only barrier between us and annihilation. The morning after our double checks of oxygen systems, the trench seemed almost alive, pressing against the viewport with an awareness that made every movement inside the lab feel measured. As we prepared for another round of sensor scans, my eyes caught a faint glimmer from the depths, a strange object, suspended in the black water, just beyond reach. Mark immediately leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Look at that. We should grab it," he said, a grin masking unease. I shook my head, remembering the clear warning from orientation, Rule 7, never touch unknown objects found in the trench, even if they seem harmless. The trench didn't care about our intentions. Touching anything unfamiliar could provoke a response we couldn't survive. Mark frowned, stepping back slightly as the object shifted subtly in the currents, almost as if it were aware of our gaze. "It looks metallic, maybe old equipment," he murmured. I pressed my hand against the console, feeling the vibration from the hull beneath our feet. The Mariana Trench had taught me through weeks of terror that appearances were deceptive. What seemed inert might be alive or sentient. And Rule 7, never touch unknown objects found in the trench, even if they seem harmless, wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline. One wrong move could summon attention from the abyss, something that had already been watching us. Hours passed as we observed the object, trying to determine if it was simply debris or something more sinister. Its slow movements, almost deliberate, made my skin crawl. Every pulse of the hull, every faint vibration through the floor, reminded me of the trench's patience and intelligence. Mark kept glancing toward it, clearly tempted, but I restrained both of us with a firm tone. "We don't touch it. No exceptions." The rule wasn't about curiosity or analysis. It was about survival, and the trench punished recklessness instantly. By mid-afternoon, the object drifted closer, propelled by currents we couldn't measure. I could feel a subtle resonance through the hull, as though the trench itself were testing our restraint. Mark whispered nervously, "What if it's a probe, maybe from another expedition?" I shook my head, reminding myself that any contact, no matter how well-intentioned, could provoke consequences beyond comprehension. The Mariana Trench didn't respond to curiosity, it responded to interaction. Obeying Rule 7 was a thin line between staying alive and becoming another lost story in its depths. Later, As we documented sensor readings, the object moved again, reflecting light in strange patterns. Mark glanced at me, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. "I don't like watching it drift," he admitted quietly. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in sync with the vibrations through the floor. Every instinct screamed that touching it would be fatal. The trench outside wasn't just dark, it was aware, patient, and deliberate. Following the rule wasn't just technical compliance, it was instinct, a shield against forces we barely understood. Night fell, and the trench's blackness deepened into a tangible weight pressing on the viewport. Shadows twisted around the object, subtle but deliberate, like the trench was testing our discipline. I continued documenting from the lab, meticulously recording every drift and pulse, ensuring nothing went unnoticed. Mark leaned closer, muttering under his breath, "It's almost alive." I nodded grimly, knowing the risk we faced if we even thought about breaching Rule 7. Never touch unknown objects found in the trench, even if they seem harmless. The abyss measured intent, and even a fleeting thought of contact could draw attention. Hours became a blur as we maintained our vigil. The trench's subtle movements outside seemed coordinated, synchronized, almost intelligent. Every time the object floated into a new position, the floor vibrated faintly beneath us, a reminder that the Mariana Trench was observing, calculating, and patient. I whispered the rule again under my breath, both as a warning and a reassurance that our restraint might be the difference between survival and annihilation. Compliance wasn't passive, it was active, vigilant, and constant. By dawn, the object had drifted out of immediate range, but its presence lingered in the corner of my mind, an unsettling reminder of the trench's awareness. Mark finally spoke, voice low, "I don't think I want to see it move again." I nodded silently, aware that the rule had saved us from tempting fate. The Mariana Trench outside the viewport pulsed subtly, a reminder that it noticed everything, and any interaction, no matter how minor, could provoke catastrophic attention. Obedience had kept us safe, but vigilance would be our only companion in the hours to come. Even after returning to the main lab, I continued to monitor all systems and sensors, acutely aware of the trench's sentience and patience. Every faint vibration, every pulse of light or shadow, reminded me that Rule 7, never touch unknown objects found in the trench, even if they seem harmless, was not a guideline, it was a survival mandate. The object may have seemed distant now, but the memory of its subtle, deliberate movement and the trench's response to our gaze would haunt us. Every cautious action was essential, every glance measured, and every rule obeyed was the thin barrier keeping us alive. Hours later, when the object finally drifted out of sensor range entirely, Mark exhaled deeply, tension visible in every line of his body. I, however, remained alert, scanning the darkness for any other anomalies that might appear. The Mariana Trench did not forgive ignorance or curiosity, and the day's restraint had been a crucial exercise in survival. Following Rule 7 had preserved our lives for another cycle, but the awareness that the abyss continued to observe, always patient and deliberate, pressed on me with unrelenting weight. The day after the encounter with the drifting object, the Mariana Trench seemed to press against the viewport more heavily, as if aware of our intentions and measuring our restraint. Shadows of unexplored caverns loomed in the distance, shifting subtly with the currents, teasing with hidden secrets. I recalled the clear warning, Rule 8, never venture into unknown trenches or caverns without full team approval. The rule had always felt restrictive, but now, staring into the blackness beyond our instruments, I understood it was life or death. One wrong move into the abyss alone could erase us entirely. Mark peered at the distant cavern openings with fascination, curiosity glinting in his eyes. "Just a quick look," he suggested, half smiling, half nervous. I shook my head firmly, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "No, the rule exists for a reason. We don't go alone, and we don't go without approval." The trench outside seemed to pulse faintly, almost in response to our conversation, and I realized that any unsanctioned movement could provoke attention. Compliance wasn't a suggestion, it was survival. Hours passed as we scanned the uncharted areas with sonar and video feeds. Every shadow, every ripple, and every subtle reflection in the water felt alive. Mark leaned in closer, muttering under his breath, "It's like the trench is aware." I nodded silently, keeping my hands firmly on the controls, resisting the urge to steer our submersible or light into the unexplored darkness. The Mariana Trench had a patience born of incomprehensible scale, and Rule 8, never venture into unknown trenches or caverns without full team approval, was a boundary we dared not cross. By mid-afternoon, the currents outside shifted in strange patterns, sweeping past caverns and twisting around unseen formations. The trench's awareness seemed heightened, almost as if it was testing us, observing whether we would obey the rule or succumb to curiosity. My pulse quickened at every subtle vibration transmitted through the hull. Mark's usual bravado had evaporated entirely, replaced with quiet tension. Every inch of uncharted water could conceal threats we had no hope of surviving alone. Later, a faint glow appeared from a distant cavern, undulating like a living thing. Mark's eyes widened in fascination, but I gripped his arm. "We do not approach it, not alone, not without approval," I warned. The Mariana Trench pulsed rhythmically, almost communicative, and I realized that the rule existed because the abyss could detect hesitation and intent. Disregarding it, even subtly, might be fatal. Obedience wasn't optional here, it was instinct. Hours stretched into night, and the darkness outside the viewport deepened to a near-tangible weight. The cavern shadows shifted, flickering in ways that made the mind question its own perception. Mark whispered, almost to himself, "It feels alive." I didn't reply, only monitored the instruments, and documented every movement, every current, and every reflection. Rule 8. Never venture into unknown trenches or caverns without full team approval, echoed in my mind, a lifeline we couldn't afford to ignore. Even the thought of moving closer without the team's sanction felt like drawing the trench's attention deliberately. By midnight, we had documented several anomalies in the caverns, unusual currents, faint glimmers that might have been bioluminescent organisms, and subtle vibrations that pulsed with uncanny regularity. I felt my hands shaking as I logged the readings, every instinct screaming that the trench outside was aware of our proximity and our restraint. Mark stayed silent, eyes glued to the feeds, finally understanding the deadly seriousness of the rule. One impulsive move, one rogue step, and we would not survive the Mariana Trench's patient observation. Hours later, as we prepared to return to the main lab, a sudden pulse of pressure ran through the hull, subtle but distinct. The trench was reminding us that it noticed our every movement, our every decision, and our adherence to the rules. I whispered aloud the rule a second time, both as a warning and a reassurance. Rule 8. Never venture into unknown trenches or caverns without full team approval. The words were a ritual, a way to acknowledge the invisible intelligence outside, and to remind ourselves that compliance was our only shield. By dawn, the cavern's shadows receded into the distance, yet the memory of their silent, patient observation remained. The trench was alive, aware, and infinitely patient. I documented every detail of our expedition, noting subtle patterns and anomalies that could be used to anticipate the trench's behavior. Mark finally relaxed slightly, but the tension lingered. Even returning to the lab's center felt perilous, as if the Mariana Trench's awareness followed us, reminding us that exploration without approval was tantamount to inviting death. Even as we settled back into the lab, the caverns remained in my mind, an uncharted menace lurking beyond the sensors. Every vibration, every shadow, every current seemed amplified by the trench's presence. Compliance with Rule 8. Never venture into unknown trenches or caverns without full team approval had preserved our lives today, but the abyss remained patient, waiting for the moment we might falter. Survival depended on restraint, vigilance, and unwavering respect for the rules that governed this underwater hell. By the following morning, the Mariana Trench felt heavier than ever, its immense darkness pressing against the lab's viewport with an almost tangible weight. Even minor fluctuations in pressure or temperature could spell disaster down here, and orientation had drilled Rule 9. Never ignore sudden changes in water pressure or temperature, no matter how minor. Into my mind, I noticed the sensors flickering slightly, a subtle rise in pressure that could have been dismissed as normal, but instinct screamed otherwise. Mark, as always, hovered near the instruments, unaware of the gravity behind even minor deviations. Ignoring this was not an option. A small ripple ran through the hull, almost imperceptible, but my chest tightened instantly. "Did you feel that?" I asked, voice barely a whisper. Mark glanced up from the readings, frowning. "Feels normal to me." I shook my head, my hands steadying on the console. "No, you don't get it. The trench doesn't forgive oversight. Every fluctuation, every shift in temperature or pressure, no matter how insignificant it seemed, could escalate into catastrophic danger." I reminded myself silently, Rule 9, never ignore sudden changes in water pressure or temperature, no matter how minor, as I adjusted the readings and logged every variation meticulously. Hours passed in tense silence, with the subtle vibrations beneath our boots intensifying unpredictably. The trench seemed to measure us, responding to every oversight and hesitation. Mark, growing increasingly uneasy, finally muttered, "It's like it's alive, feeling us." I nodded grimly, my eyes glued to the instruments. The water's pressure rose slightly near a vent, and a chill ran through me. Ignoring even the smallest anomaly could provoke a response. The Mariana Trench wasn't just a void, it was a sentient patient predator, and we were the prey. Later, a minor spike in temperature across the outer sensors caught my attention. Mark leaned in, curious, but I pressed him back. "Do not touch anything yet. Just observe." Every tiny variation in the readings seemed amplified by the trench's awareness, as if the abyss itself were testing our discipline. Even a fleeting glance away from the instruments could be fatal. I whispered to myself for focus and reassurance, Rule 9, never ignore sudden changes in water pressure or temperature, no matter how minor. Saying it aloud grounded me, a ritual of survival in a place that didn't forgive mistakes. By mid-afternoon, the pressure fluctuated unpredictably along one of the cavern walls, subtle shifts that could easily be dismissed by an untrained observer. The Mariana Trench responded to intent as much as action, and I realized that even minor negligence could be catastrophic. Mark leaned closer, whispering, "It's just water, right?" I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "Not down here, not in this trench. Every anomaly matters." The rules weren't suggestions, they were boundaries. Ignoring even the smallest cue could draw the trench's attention in deadly ways. Hours stretched on, each slight pulse and temperature change escalating my anxiety. The trench seemed to communicate through these minute fluctuations, testing our patience and compliance. Mark remained close, silent now, eyes wide as he began to understand the necessity of vigilance. I checked and rechecked all readings, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. One careless dismissal could provoke a chain reaction, and the Mariana Trench was infinitely patient yet merciless in its consequences. Night fell, and the shadows outside the viewport deepened, twisting subtly as the currents shifted with alarming irregularity. Every slight increase in water pressure made my hands tremble as I logged the readings. Mark shivered next to me, finally silent, aware that even minor mistakes could cost us our lives. I reminded myself once more, quietly but firmly, Rule 9, never ignore sudden changes in water pressure or temperature, no matter how minor, acknowledging that compliance here wasn't just procedural, it was the difference between life and death. Hours later, a small vent on the edge of the trench suddenly expelled a surge of cold water, and the hull vibrated faintly but unmistakably. Mark jumped, eyes wide, and I immediately instructed him to stabilize the instruments and recalibrate the pressure monitors. Even the faintest disruption could escalate rapidly, and I realized the Mariana Trench could respond unpredictably to oversight. Following the rule wasn't optional. It was instinctual, a necessary tether to reality in a world defined by incomprehensible darkness. By dawn, the trench's presence remained palpably oppressive, and every vibration, fluctuation, and pulse reminded me that observation alone was not enough. Vigilance, precise documentation, and respect for the rules were essential for survival. Mark finally muttered, "Okay, I get it. I'll follow every reading, every rule." I nodded silently, knowing that our obedience had preserved us for another day. The trench was patient, sentient, and calculating. Ignoring Rule 9 even once could have ended us, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily against my chest. Even after securing the lab for the morning, every shift in water pressure or temperature resonated in my mind, reminding me that the Mariana Trench observed continuously. Every anomaly, no matter how minor, had to be logged, noted, and respected. Compliance with Rule 9: never ignore sudden changes in water pressure or temperature, no matter how minor was the difference between life and death, and I knew that the trench would continue to test our vigilance endlessly. The day following our careful monitoring of pressure and temperature, an unsettling creak echoed through the lab as a distant submersible report flagged a minor structural anomaly. My stomach tightened instantly. The Mariana Trench had already punished curiosity and neglect more than once, and I knew what could happen if we ignored the warning. Orientation drilled Rule 10: never enter a damaged submersible or unsupervised equipment without inspection and approval into our minds. And now, staring at the alert on the monitor, I felt the weight of its importance. Even minor oversight here could mean suffocation, entrapment, or worse. Mark glanced at the alert, excitement flickering in his eyes. "Maybe we could just check it out quickly. I bet it's nothing serious." I shook my head sharply, feeling a chill run down my spine. No, the rule isn't optional. The Mariana Trench doesn't forgive mistakes. Every vibration in the hull, every ripple across the viewport, reminded me that even a seemingly harmless decision could draw attention from the abyss. Ignoring Rule 10 would be the same as inviting disaster directly into our confined space. Hours passed as the main team conducted remote diagnostics. I hovered over the instrument panel, eyes scanning the readouts, heart hammering with every minor fluctuation. The submersible's outer shell showed stress points and microfractures, subtle but significant. Mark leaned closer, whispering, "We could just go in for a look. It's probably fine." I pressed my hand over his, silencing him. "No, even minor breaches can be fatal down here. We follow the rule, always." The Mariana Trench was patient, intelligent, and unforgiving. The moment we violated protocol, we risked provoking its awareness. Later, while observing the sensor data, a faint shadow passed near the damaged submersible, gliding unnaturally through the black water. Mark's excitement faded instantly, replaced by tense unease. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I nodded silently, eyes glued to the instruments. The trench seemed to pulse with subtle currents, as though measuring our restraint. Obeying Rule 10: never enter a damaged submersible or unsupervised equipment without inspection and approval wasn't bureaucratic. It was the difference between survival and becoming another ghost story swallowed by the abyss. By mid-afternoon, the submersible's minor damage had stabilized, but the shadow lingered outside, moving in patterns that seemed deliberate. The trench had a patient intelligence, and it could sense even the smallest infraction of protocol. Mark muttered, almost to himself, "I don't know if I can wait." I exhaled slowly, gripping the console. We have to obey the rule, or we risk everything. Compliance wasn't a suggestion here. It was instinctive, a lifeline tethering us to survival. Even a brief lapse could attract attention from the trench that we might not escape. Hours later, the remote diagnostic completed, confirming structural integrity was sufficient only if we continued to follow protocols meticulously. The trench's presence pressed against the viewport with almost sentient weight. Every vibration, every subtle ripple reminded me that impatience or recklessness could provoke catastrophic consequences. I whispered the rule again, quietly but firmly. Rule 10. Never enter a damaged submersible or unsupervised equipment without inspection and approval, acknowledging that obedience was the only barrier protecting us from the Mariana Trench's patient awareness. Night fell, and the darkness outside the viewport thickened, almost tangible in its intensity. Shadows from the damaged submersible stretched and shifted, and the currents carried the faintest ripples of movement, as if something observed our every breath. Mark sat silent beside me, finally understanding that violating the rule could invite attention we couldn't defend against. I continued to monitor the submersible remotely, meticulously logging every fluctuation, every vibration, every potential anomaly. Following the rule wasn't just about machinery, it was about staying alive in a trench that measured intent as sharply as action. By dawn, the submersible was secured, and all systems confirmed operational without breach. Mark finally relaxed, exhaling a long breath. I get it now. I'll never rush into something unsupervised again, he said quietly. I nodded, still tense, scanning every shadow and ripple beyond the viewport. The Mariana Trench was patient but observant, and our survival depended on obedience to the rules. Any lapse, any small act of negligence, could draw attention from forces far beyond our comprehension. Rule 10 had preserved our lives for another day, but the abyss remained waiting, relentless and calculating. Even as we returned to routine sensor checks, the memory of the submersible and the trench's subtle responses lingered. The Mariana Trench didn't forgive recklessness, and every rule reinforced boundaries that kept us alive. Every vibration, every shadow, every fluctuation was measured, and obeying Rule 10, never enter a damaged submersible or unsupervised equipment without inspection and approval, was a practice in vigilance, patience, and survival. The abyss tested us constantly, and only strict adherence to the rules allowed us to endure another day in its presence. Hours passed quietly, but tension never eased. The submersible's shadow, the trench's awareness, and the patience of the abyss created an oppressive weight that pressed against our nerves and consciousness. I documented every minor detail meticulously, aware that the trench's intelligence could detect any lapse in attention. Compliance with Rule 10 had been life-saving, but I knew the Mariana Trench would continue testing us, always patient, always waiting for the moment we faltered. The Mariana Trench had grown almost suffocatingly silent that morning. Yet I could feel its presence pressing against the viewport, patient and deliberate. Every shadow, every subtle ripple, every flicker of bioluminescent light seemed to follow our movements, as if the abyss was measuring our attention, our restraint, and our fear. I whispered under my breath, almost in prayer, Rule 11. Never underestimate the intelligence of the Mariana Trench. It watches and learns, trying to steady my racing thoughts. This wasn't hyperbole. Every survival story we had heard now made sense. The trench was sentient, calculating, and infinitely patient, and we were its unwitting subjects. Mark hovered close, eyes wide and tense, muttering, It's almost like it knows us." I didn't answer immediately, feeling a shiver run down my spine as I observed the subtle movements in the abyss. The shadows outside the viewport weren't random. They shifted in deliberate patterns, responding to our actions, our hesitation, our breathing. Every decision we made seemed to provoke a ripple in the water, a pulse of awareness from the trench itself. Rule 11 wasn't just the final rule. It was the foundation of every other rule we had been forced to follow. Without respecting it, we had no chance. Hours passed in a tense rhythm of observation and documentation. Every instrument reading, every minor anomaly, every fluctuation in light or pressure was meticulously recorded. Mark and I moved slowly, deliberately, almost as if conscious of each heartbeat. "Do you think it notices our thoughts?" he whispered, voice trembling. I didn't respond, only continued logging, realizing that any underestimation of the trench's intelligence could provoke something catastrophic. The abyss outside wasn't merely an environment, it was a predator with patience measured in years, watching, learning, anticipating. By mid-afternoon, subtle changes in the water currents hinted at shifts in unseen forces, almost as if the trench was testing our limits. Mark's hand shook as he adjusted a sensor, eyes fixed on the viewport. "I think it's learning from us," he said quietly. I nodded grimly, keeping my voice steady. We had survived countless near misses, but Rule 11, never underestimate the intelligence of the Mariana Trench. It watches and learns was the key. Every other rule had been a safeguard, but the abyss's mind was a force beyond comprehension. Any lapse could result in immediate consequences, or consequences measured over time, unseen and patient. Later I observed a faint reflection on the far side of the viewport, a shadow that mimicked our movements subtly, almost unnervingly. My pulse quickened as I realized this was no random occurrence. The Mariana Trench was studying us, calculating our reactions, and perhaps predicting our next actions. Mark leaned closer, muttering, "It's like it's alive, thinking." I swallowed hard, aware that our survival depended not only on obedience to the rules, but on absolute vigilance. The trench's intelligence was deliberate, methodical, and utterly incomprehensible. As night fell, the darkness beyond the viewport became almost tangible, pressing against our consciousness. Every shadow, every subtle movement, every faint vibration in the hull felt deliberate, as if the trench was communicating silently, testing our nerves. I adjusted the instruments with trembling hands, careful to avoid even the smallest infraction. The Mariana Trench wasn't just a void, it was an active observer, a predator that learned. Whispering again under my breath, Rule 11, never underestimate the intelligence of the Mariana Trench. It watches and learns. I reminded myself and Mark that this rule was not merely advisory, it was absolute. Hours later, a sudden ripple of pressure coursed through the lab, subtle but unmistakable. My stomach twisted with dread, and I froze at the console, aware that the trench was monitoring even the minutest hesitation. Mark's eyes were wide, fixed on the viewport, as shadows twisted unnaturally. "Do you think it's testing us?" he whispered. I nodded silently, realizing that the trench's intelligence was unlike anything human. A sentient, patient, calculating entity that did not forgive curiosity or mistake. Our survival depended entirely on compliance, restraint, and awareness. By dawn, the trench outside seemed almost to pulse with intent, dark currents shifting like living thoughts, pressing against our perception. Every minor fluctuation, every shadow, every reflection in the water could be a test, a measure of our awareness. I documented meticulously, whispering again, as if repetition could anchor us. Rule 11. Never underestimate the intelligence of the Mariana Trench. It watches and learns. Mark remained tense, but silent now, fully aware that any underestimation could be fatal. The abyss didn't forget, and it didn't forgive. Even as we secured the lab, preparing for another day, the trench's presence lingered like a heavy fog, patient, intelligent, and observant. Every movement, every breath, every subtle gesture could be measured and learned from, shaping the abyss's understanding of us. Obedience had preserved us to this point, but the Mariana Trench waited, always patient, always watching, always learning. I realized that surviving the abyss wasn't about daring exploits. It was about humility, vigilance, and the relentless respect of rules older than we could imagine. The day ended, yet unease persisted. Every shadow, every subtle ripple, every pulse of pressure reminded me that the trench's intelligence was eternal, patient, and calculating. Mark's unease mirrored my own, and we remained silent, watching, documenting, and obeying. The Mariana Trench did not sleep, it did not forget, and it was always learning. We were alive only because we respected the rules, but there was no guarantee we would remain so tomorrow. A faint vibration ran through the lab, almost imperceptible, but it made my chest tighten. I glanced at Mark, whose eyes mirrored the same realization I felt. The abyss beyond the viewport was aware, patient, intelligent, and observant. Whispering one final time under my breath, I acknowledged the truth of survival in this sentient darkness. Rule 11. Never underestimate the intelligence of the Mariana Trench. It watches and learns. And yet, despite our vigilance, I could not shake the feeling that it already knew something we did not, and I feared we would never understand what it had learned, or when it might act. The trench remained dark, patient, and watching. Our instruments hummed softly, but I felt its awareness in every shadow, every pulse, every ripple. There was no end to its patience, no mercy, and no certainty of survival beyond the next breath. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.